Hello and welcome to this update edition of Burning Earth Radio. This is your host, Gerard Spring, coming to you from the north. Today is a very sad day indeed, for today is the day that the internet is no longer free. I'd like to take a moment to recognize the cataclysmic effect that the end of net neutrality will have on the internet. This is a massive handover of institutional power from the people to the corporate, and it paves the way for a new level of information control that we have not seen with regards to internet communications. This is a very serious development, and it'll be interesting and most likely frustrating to watch how it plays out. As of right now, we're not entirely sure how this is going to be incorporated into modern telecommunications infrastructure, but one can be assured that the results will not be good. The world has changed tremendously within the past 5 years, and I think it's really important to look at how these changes in the world are affecting how we as individuals live in the world and how the technology is affecting basic aspects of everyday life. I came across a story a couple of weeks ago about Facebook, and I thought it was really interesting, and it received briefly quite a bit of traffic. Seems like there was a lot of people talking about it, but very quickly the story was sort of removed from consciousness or from internet consciousness. And what this story was about was how Facebook was exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. And the idea was that this was known from the very beginning of Facebook, and they didn't completely understand what they were setting out to do, but they were essentially trying to make the software as addictive as possible. And it works by the social validation feedback loop. So when you're using this software and you're using this technology, you get a sense of validation on a psychodynamic level when someone is liking your posts or paying attention to your profile. And this does two things. It causes a split in the personality in one sense. So when you're using the technology, you will develop a alter ego or an alter self through Facebook that doesn't really reflect your everyday life. And this idea is actually multiplied across every social media platform that you use. So if you use Snapchat, then you'll have a personality for that. If you use Instagram, you'll have a personality for that. Facebook, you'll have a personality for that. If you have LinkedIn, you'll have a personality for that. You'll be profiled based on your personality. And all of these personalities that you develop on the internet have a tendency to fracture your mind in a sense. You become kind of dissociative. If you go around nowadays and talk to people, you will notice that people are in general very dissociative, especially if they have heavy exposure to these technologies. And by heavy exposure, I mean daily use of these technologies or even hourly use of these technologies, where their life essentially becomes inseparable from these technologies. There's a sense of dissociativity that comes with this, splitting up of the self around the concept of the image that is created in the technology. So who are you? Are you your Facebook profile? Are you your Instagram profile? Are you your Snapchat profile? It's a very dangerous road to go down because it actually has the effect of eroding civil discourse. People can no longer have conversations anymore, and conversations tend to revolve around things going on in the social media sphere or in the news media sphere. Truly, when it comes to the internet nowadays, one has to be very skeptical of everything that one looks at, especially if it's coming from mainstream sources. And by mainstream sources, I mean any mainstream news site that has a lot of viewership, or any even YouTube channels that get a lot of viewership. Anything that's not completely independent or has outside funding, you have to be extremely skeptical of. A lot of these news sites are producing weaponized media, and the idea is to create a very dissociative looking world in which people don't really have access to high quality journalism. A lot of the news stories out there, especially in mainstream Western news, are very contrived, if you will. They're very it's very much like a propaganda. You have to look at it like propaganda. You have to look at it through the eye and mind of a propagandist. What is the culture that the news is trying to create? And how does the news article emphasize aspects of that culture? Looking into superficiality and the lack of depth, the lack of critical thinking that comes along with this, that when looking at these news articles and looking at this internet media, there's very, very little actual content there. There's a certain trick or meme or mimetic entity that the news article is trying to ingrain in your head, to try and imprint in your consciousness. And with that also comes a certain position on reality, a certain localization of the self within the reality around the news article, in the sense that when one wakes up and exists in society, one has this sense of, okay, this is who I am, this is the world I'm living in. And people really need that. People really need that. And in general, in the old model of civilization, this was provided by the community. But nowadays, this is provided by the business and the workplace and the internet and the media and the Facebook and the Twitter and everything that's going on out there. It's very dangerous when you secretly are giving up a part of yourself to participate in the community. It's a very slippery slope. At what point do you retain your individual consciousness? At what point are you no longer you? At what point do you just become a mouthpiece for all of the propagandists, an amplifier, if you will, for the mimetic entities that are pushed out into the consciousness of society? There's a great number of things going on in the world right now that people aren't really aware of, especially when it comes to the development of global governance structures, for example. Looking into the European Union, the soft utopia, essentially what you have is a transfer of sovereignty from the individual member states to the Union. Or you have an example in the United States where the political system often masquerades as a democracy when in fact you have a system of authoritarian corporatism. Why would you vote for people who are receiving money and receiving support from the very corporations that are oppressing you? It's a very strange thing, and yet people continue to do it. People don't go out and question the real source of the problem, which is corruption. There is corruption in pretty much every system of government nowadays. All of these governments are extremely corrupt, and the system of money nowadays is farcically corrupt. When you have electronic currency whizzing around, debts appearing and disappearing, getting repackaged and resold, and interest rates going up and down and all over the place, when in reality, all of this is, again, just a distraction. The whole purpose of the system of employment and the system of money and the system of working is to prevent you from having the time to think for yourself. This is why in many societies in the Western world, you see working hours going up rather than down. The less time you have to think for yourself, the more imperialized you become by the system. And eventually you become a mouthpiece for the system. It's very important to read. It's very important to connect back to these old technologies of reading. It's very interesting that nowadays there's very little in the ways of actual reading that goes on. If you look at the way that typical news and media is packaged nowadays, it's very much visual or auditory. There's not very much in terms of textual. Oftentimes, when I'm scanning through the internet and scanning through internet media to try and figure out what's going on out there, I find myself glazing past the text and just looking at the pictures and the headlines. And the fact is that it's very difficult to actually delve into the text of these articles because you become a little bit impatient in a way. It's almost as if the media has a way of making one impatient. It becomes very difficult to actually look into things in detail. And I'm a pretty intellectual person. I like to read. I read quite a lot, and I'm quite used to doing really detailed analysis of things. And I find it interesting that this is how I'm approaching these articles when I do self-reflection, because if I'm doing this, I'm certain that other people are doing this as well. It's a natural thing, I think, to kind of pass over this a lot of this information in a very superficial way. Truly, it's almost impossible to take in the sheer volume of information that's pushed through the internet media outlets every day. Literally thousands of stories. It's impossible to read all of them. It's impossible to understand what's going on in the world, almost. And if you really think about it, you have to have some anchor to hold on to in order to feel like you have an identity and to feel like you have a place in the world. This is the effect of hyper news and the eroding of the structure and the eroding of the system of self and the individual as an autonomous thinking unit. So I also would like to take a look at some cultural aspects, particularly in terms of Western culture and the decrease in quality of life. Lack of access to education is becoming a big problem in the West. It's becoming extremely expensive, and it doesn't look like that's going to be turning around anytime soon with all of the debt schemes that are going on around education and lack of consumer protection and things of the sorts. You also have the employment concept changing quite a lot as well, where employment is starting to look a lot more like an indentured kind of servitude or a type of servitude or slavery than it did before. You know, the human resources, the term is actually a term that was borrowed from slavery. It was borrowed from the slave days, where the human resource director was actually the slave foreman, if you will, on the working on the slave crews in the South. So this very interesting in a way to see how this terminology has found such a great utility and such a great fondness with corporate culture, because corporate culture is essentially a slave-based model. It's a hierarchy, and it's a hierarchical system of enslavement. Everyone is afraid of losing their job, because losing their job means losing their income, and losing their income means they won't be able to survive, because in today's society, you have to pay to survive. You have to pay to live. And there's something insidious about that, because truly, life is free. I didn't sign up to pay to survive. And it's quite interesting when you look at inflationary monetary systems and how the need to pay to survive is ultimately the need to pay debt into a fictitious system which is heavily biased against the liberation of the individual. Everything is about power and control. Truly. Never forget that. Everything is about power and control. So when you observe something happening in the world, ask, what is the transfer of power and who is in control? It's something that's fundamental to human nature, I think. Now, generally, this is a show about climate change and the effects that climate has on our future and the effects that we are having on the future of our climate systems. However, climate change is actually a very multifaceted issue because it brings up a lot of psychodynamic complexes, both at the individual level and at the social level. How can it be that we have exhausted the resources of the planet? How can it be that we, who perceive ourselves as being fundamentally good and fundamentally positive beings for the world, have caused so much destruction via our political and economic systems? How is it that we, as people, can adjust ourselves to the future in which we have a severe and abrupt climate change scenario? It's pretty hard to wrap one's head around when you consider that there are probably about 2 billion people who are in immediate threat of climate change related migrations, famines, etc. And soon this will hit the Western countries as well. You cannot exploit any resource forever. And very soon, I think we're going to begin to see the limits of resource extraction. Everything is becoming so squeezed. Everything is becoming so expensive, if you've noticed. Life itself is becoming very expensive. And this is a subtle observation to recognize that relationship between the expense of life in a climate change scenario. That's going to be the new normal. In addition to the fact that you are going to have an increasing amount of ratcheting down of the global power structure and the international control grid, as I like to call it, to prevent the freedom of movement and to prevent the exchange of information. This is the whole point of the passport control grid. Nothing is to keep you safe. Everything is to keep you under control. That's the key. Truly, it's an amazing world that we live in nowadays. And it's amazing that people fall into the trap of thinking that the system is legitimate. The system was created by humankind. It was created by mankind. And we have to question always the motivations of those who are in control of the system. Very rarely in history have the controllers of civilization worked in the favor of those whom they control. So I'd like to go ahead and wrap this one up. It's been an interesting experience to go through and share some of these thoughts with you. I know it could be a little bit interesting for a lot of people, a lot of interesting ideas coming out right now. I'll be trying to do shows here more often in the future. I've had a lot of tumultuous changes coming in my life, a lot of moving around, a lot of organizing, a lot of paperwork, a lot of projects that were truly unexpected. So I truly hope to be able to get back on the radio here and share more information about what's going on with the climate system, as well as take a deeper look at some of the social, psychological, spiritual changes that we have lying in front of us. So if you like this one, please hit that like button and subscribe, and I'm looking forward to having you along the next one. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to my Patreons who are helping to support the show, and I hope to be able to deliver as much interesting content to you as I can here in the future. Again, thank you so much for listening.